Hello everyone, and Simchat Purim. In this video we are going to take a brief look at chapter 4, a confrontation which is in contrast to the previous confrontations. At this point in the story, we know about Haman's diabolical plan, and we know that the king is an enabler. So the conflict at this point exists between the king and Haman on one side and the Jewish community on the other. Not even a conflict between the general population of Persia, because we learned that the people of Shushan were confounded and perplexed about this extermination plan of Haman. They had no claims against the Jewish community, no complaints. So up to now, the confrontation is one between Haman, the king, on one side, and the Jewish community on the other. Chapter 4, we find a unique confrontation previously not revealed, and this will be a confrontation between Mordechai and Esther. And I mention confrontation because on the surface it appears that they are in the midst of a major disagreement. But I'm going to suggest to you that perhaps it's a chapter not about a conflict concerning whether or not the Jews should respond to Haman, but rather what kind of tactics should be employed in responding to Haman. So as I share some of these verses, I'll pose a few questions, and I leave it to you to formulate your own opinions. The very beginning of this chapter, we find Mordechai, having learned of Haman's plot, dresses up in clothes of mourning, the kinds of clothes that Jews wear when they express themselves during the time of mourning, sackcloth and ashes. I should say at this point that it is not clear whether Esther is totally aware of this plot by Haman, but we know that Mordechai is aware, because there is a proclamation that is distributed throughout the kingdom of Persia, and Mordechai, of course, learns about the plot, and his response is to be demonstrative, both in terms of physical appearance as well as verbally demonstrative. He dresses in sackcloth and ashes and goes through the city crying out loud, and he's bitter. Now, at this point, we learn nothing about the reaction of the Jewish community in total. We only know about Mordechai, but just a couple of sentences later, we learn that the Jewish community throughout Persia also engages in this in mourning, of acts of mourning, which includes dressing in sackcloth and ashes, weeping, wailing, and fasting, which was also an expression of mourning. But there is nothing which indicates that the general Jewish population did so publicly. All we learn is that they fasted, they wept, and they wailed, and that they wore clothes of mourning, but nothing about duplicating Mordechai's demonstration or partnering with Mordechai in a more public display. And that's something that's very much missing here. Last year, in the aftermath of this horrible tragedy, the murder of George Floyd, not only Black Lives Matter, but other organizations gathered, demonstrated quite verbally to express communal outrage over ongoing racism in America. This is something which is, unfortunately, there's a continuous need for such demonstrations. But the point is, it was that these demonstrations were collective. The Jewish people at this point are not responding in any kind of public fashion, and this has been a pattern throughout Jewish history. The question is it a pattern because Jews are reluctant to risk their lives, or is it because simply there was no other response, that by public demonstration they would all be immediately killed, and therefore it would negate the effectiveness of any demonstration? I think about Bialik's poem. Bialik was the great poet laureate of the Jewish people. Following the Kishinev pogroms in 1903, he wrote a poem, Bayir Harigal, in the city of slaughter, which part of it he castigates the Jewish men for sitting around and cowering behind objects while their women were being ravaged. In other words, doing little to defend their women and to defend themselves. One of the great and unprecedented acts of the Jewish people, one of the great experiences, is the development of a Jewish army. Prior to the establishment of the State of Israel and then following the State of Israel. An army which defends the Jewish people. That was not always so indicative of our past. And the question is it because we just lacked the ability or was it out of fear? So I want you to bear that in mind. But at this point, it seems that the people are only responding passively. Mordechai alone is demonstrative. Esther, again, we said we don't know whether how much she's aware of the circumstance, but since Mordechai has come up to the palace gate, Esther's servants must see him, become aware of what he's doing, visibly notice his dress, and they inform Esther about Mordechai's condition, and Esther sends clothing for Mordechai to wear so that he should take off his sackcloth. But Mordechai refuses. So the question here is, what is bothering Esther? Is she bothered by the fact that Mordechai is making waves? That Mordechai is causing too much attention to the Jewish community, despite the fact that the community is in jeopardy of being exterminated? Or does she have another motive? Perhaps she has developed her own plan, one which for now she keeps to herself and does not share with anyone, and therefore she tries to convince Mordechai to change his clothing because she has a better plan. So this confrontation, this initial stage of a confrontation between Mordechai and Esther, is it because Esther doesn't want him to make waves, or is it because she has a plan but can't reveal it now? The text doesn't really tell us anything, but we see that there's an exchange which takes place. Esther sends her servant to find out what Mordechai's motives are. Mordechai responds by revealing everything concerning Haman's diabolical plot, and even all of the details. Even Mordechai knows that, and this must have been revealed publicly in the decree, that Haman offered to pay a bribe to the royal treasury. And he offers Esther all kinds of information, evidence to prove Haman's plot is real, that it is not just hearsay. At this point again, Esther may or may not have known, but when Mordechai conveys all of this information to Esther's servant, the servant comes back to Esther, and then Esther sends her servant back with a message from Mordechai. And the message is, I am not permitted to approach the king or to enter the king's chamber unless he extends his golden scepter, and he has not done that. Basically what Esther is saying to him is, what do you want me to do? I can't do anything about it now because I have not been granted permission to have an audience with the king, and were I to do so without authorization, I might be killed on the spot. So Mordechai takes this to be an act of reluctance, an act of timidity on Esther's part. She simply does not want to reveal to the king the plot against the Jews, whereas perhaps that's not the case. Perhaps all Esther is saying is, look, if I take your approach and I try to address the king without prior authorization, I might be killed immediately. So therefore it will render that kind of plan ineffective. Maybe what Esther is hinting at is that she has another plan. She has another way to approach the king. Mordechai just has to be patient. But we see here that maybe there's a tactical difference. So I just pose that question to you. Was she refusing, or was she just strategizing? And strategy is an issue. It's not a perfect analogy, but there's always been great debate about the response of specific Jewish communities to Nazi authority, the Nazi authority in the ghettos and elsewhere. There were many Jews and Jewish organizations which tried to maintain Jewish spirit, Jewish culture. We know about Emanuel Ringelblum's Oneg Shabbat in the Warsaw Ghetto, trying to write an account of all that happened, to chronicle what was taking place in the Jewish community. There are others, perhaps now with hindsight, who argue that rather than wasting our time on culture, we should have put all our efforts into obtaining weapons so that we could fight back, because cultural survival, cultural resistance means little if the Jewish community is exterminated. So these are the issues that are presented in the Megillah, are issues that are also apparent in later on regarding other episodes in Jewish history. How do we respond to physical assaults against the Jews? And again, we don't know Esther's total motives, but we could ask the question: was Mordechai justified in pleading with Esther to appear before the king and being very vocal about it? Or do we just trust in Esther that she has another plan that right now is a little secretive, but is a plan that might ultimately become more effective? We don't know. But when Mordechai learns that Esther, for whatever reason, refuses to appear before the king, he has another message delivered to Esther. And the message is, don't think that you will survive alone. Don't think because now you're firmly ensconced in the palace that you will survive when all the other Jews are exterminated. You are a Jew. And if you don't speak out as a Jew, you will suffer the same fate as the rest of us. Some of you, perhaps who are on the older side, might remember the movie The Garden of the Finzi Contini, and it was about an affluent Italian Jewish family, somewhat insulated from all of the violence taking place against Jews outside of their lavish and more elaborate abode. But ultimately, the Nazis found them also, and they were brought to the concentration camps along with everybody else. So Mordechai is just reminding Esther, warning her that she will not survive simply because she's the queen. And at this point, whether Esther agrees with Mordechai or not, she relents and says, okay, we'll go it this way. I will approach the king, and if I die, I die. So we learn ultimately that the result of this confrontation between Mordechai and Esther is that Mordechai convinces Esther to go before the king. But still we're left with the question, does Esther believe that there is another tactic, another means of responding to Haman's extermination plan? It's not revealed here, but the greater question we can ask is, how do we respond to attacks against the Jewish people? We see from so many episodes in the past, the Jewish community was either too weak, incapable of responding with violence. At times, the weapon that the Jews have, their supreme weapon, has been the Torah and Jewish life, because that spiritual element is a mainstay throughout every generation. But we can ask ourselves, and the question's been asked. I remember being in Jerusalem, living in Jerusalem for a year, and attending a conference at the Holocaust Museum and Research Center, Yad Vashem. And during this conference, one day there was a young woman who was a teenager, an Israeli teenager, who posed the question very innocently, out of great curiosity. She said, "Look, we live in Israel. We fight back. We have an army. Why didn't you respond similarly?" And even though responses that were offered by Holocaust survivors were legitimate responses, we didn't know the magnitude of this was so great. Who could believe that the Nazis would commit such barbaric acts? We didn't have the means of obtaining weapons, and if we tried to do so, we would be killed on the spot. But nevertheless, that question remains. How do we respond to attacks against the Jewish people? Were there, again, looking with hindsight, were there or could there have been other more effective ways of responding to these potential disasters? And I think that is a question that's posed here. Mordechai argues that we need to respond aggressively, which is why he dresses as he does. There's no army at this point, but he dresses in a manner which certainly calls attention to himself. But the rest of the Jewish community is doing nothing. They're not responding except fasting within the confines of their own homes, which might fulfill some kind of a spiritual need, but will do nothing to truly affect the future of the Jewish people, even though I'm sure the community believe that God will come to our defense. So Mordechai, because there is no other demonstration, a public demonstration, Mordechai urges Esther to please speak with the king, because that is the only way we can possibly ensure our survival. And Esther again has responded by saying, I don't know if that's the most effective tactic, because the king might kill me, and then we're left with nothing. So I present all of these questions and arguments for your consideration as you read what is, I think, the pivotal chapter in the Megillah, and again, Simchat Purim.